Yeah.
Let me tell you a story, guys.
Okay, tell us a story.
A number of years ago, about 20 actually to be precise, I had a phone call from a customer, probably 2 years since I had done business with him, and he had a warranty issue. He left me a voicemail because I didn't pick up the phone.
Mm-hmm.
And as I'm listening to the voicemail, I'm thinking to myself, well, this is 2 years ago. It's past warranty, and at some point I'll call him back.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of days later, he called me back. I picked up the phone, and he just reamed me out. Like, he was so not just angry, but he attacked me personally. Like, my character was rubbish, according to this guy, because of how I handled or didn't handle calling him back in a timely manner.
Yeah.
And in the moment, I just thought, well, that's not who I am. And, you know, I'm trying to do you a favor by actually even trying to help you with a problem that's your problem. It was kind of how I digested it, the best that I could remember at the time. But as I've learned over the years, when you have communication with somebody or fail to respond to somebody in sort of this responding window, you know, this time that you need to respond to somebody, that they feel disrespected. And I think that's how he felt, as being like, you couldn't give me the time of day to respond to me. And to him, that felt like a deep character flaw. So I thought it'd be fun to dive into what responsive communication should look like.
Yeah. I think it's funny when you're saying that. I'm like, I had a scenario with communication with a client as well. Not a construction business, but nonetheless, this client called me, you know, like multiple days in a row. Like, if I didn't answer the phone, it was like you get 3 more calls in the same setting.
Right. Pick it up, basically.
Yeah. So it's like I would get like 4 missed calls from the same customer, you know, and it's funny you're talking about the like lack of communication being an issue. And then even from my side, I'm like, there's also a level to this conversation about communication and responsiveness and things like that. That's like, man, if a customer's too communicative or like reaching out to you 5 times, that's also a red flag to be aware of. So it's like kind of this balance. I think
the right level of responsiveness.
Yeah.
So we have 2 sides of the spectrum, right? So there's over communication, under communication, and probably no communication, like just avoiding communicating because there might not be something that you want to say or want to deal with.
Yeah.
So probably there's the right level. So where is that at?
Yeah. Well, and I think you have to define that because, you know, those 2 stories we're talking about, it's like there is over communication, you know, and I think one aspect to over communicating, let's just say, you know, you get a lead, you know, on your website or somebody calls you, referral, something like that. I think there's also a level of over communication that's, hey, it's setting the wrong expectation if you're calling them back too quickly or too often.
Let me challenge you on that for a second, because some of our audience is probably getting leads from lead services as well, where it's like the first come first
that's
kind
a
of
good
get
point.
it kind of a thing.
Yes.
So maybe there's a scenario in which rapid communication is really good.
Great point.
You even notice this on like website chats or things like that, where
you got to be on it quickly.
You got to be
or
on
they're
it quickly.
gone.
Right.
Great
So
point.
there's an element of maybe rapid communication is important, but I see your point though. If you're too eager, too communicative, people will think, well, and we were just talking about this earlier too, of a lot of times guys listening to this are in a no projects are actually going on right now. They're trying to win jobs. So at that point, you got all the time in the world to win the job.
Totally.
Then you win that job, and now you're trying to do it. And somebody else calls you, or that customer is trying to communicate you through that process, and you don't have the time to keep up with that. I mean, you guys are actually out there doing things, trying to build something and communicate. And so, to your point, you're setting the expectation right at the beginning.
Yeah. And I think it's just something you have to be aware of, because to your point, like if you're trying to fulfill and you're trying to sell and you're running a small business, which most of the people listening to this podcast are, it becomes super daunting to actually communicate often, right? And it's a full-time job, really.
Yep.
And so anyway, I think that's just one piece to call out, is just the over communication side of just be careful with that, because over communication is setting expectations that you're going to just drop everything at the drop of, or you're going to drop everything else to serve that customer. You're going to drop family time. You're going to drop customers. You're going to drop, you know what I mean? The work that you're doing to call them back within 5 seconds. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I think that's the expectation side of over communicating, that just there's a balance there.
I like it. I remember having a customer that would text me on weekends, and she'd be, Saturday, Sunday, sending me stuff. And in the moment, I felt annoyed. It's Sunday. What are you thinking? But I think there's also an element of not letting that stuff get us down. When somebody is communicating on a weekend with us, just ignore it. And then promptly on Monday, not treat them last to being like, hey, got your weekend message. Monday morning, you're processing that in the same queue order that you got everything else in and dealing with it.
Yeah. Well, and then to that point, it's building a good habit with your customer of like, okay, I know they don't respond on the weekend or, unless there's an emergency.
Okay.
Obviously.
So we both like making people happy.
Yeah, we do.
And so it feels very tempting in that moment. And I think people pick up on that, right? You notice how vulnerable people pick up on that? Why is it that a predator can spot somebody a mile away? More or less.
I have no idea, actually.
But it happens though. Like vulnerable people,
Yes, you're right.
more or less, they have
You're
like
right.
vulnerability stamp somewhere on them. And I think when we have this stamp on us saying, please take advantage of our willingness to want to please you.
Yeah, willingness to serve, willingness to help,
Right.
willingness to,
And so it's being like, setting those boundaries is really critical because otherwise
Definitely.
people are going to take advantage of that. Oh, I see you're eager to help and you're eager to try to take, so we're here to take advantage of that.
Yeah. It's the same thing, like even in, I think, the nonprofit world, or like my daughter goes to school and it's like the moms that don't work full-time jobs, they always get the most work assigned to them because they're available and willing, you know what I mean? Whereas I'm like, oh, well, I work full time. I can't.
Sorry.
That. It's a no, you know what I mean? But the person that says yes, it's just easier to get another yes.
Well, and they're heroes too, because they're being like, wow, did you see what Sandy did?
Yeah, exactly.
She did this all. And you're like, oh man, what did you do?
Yeah, exactly. But it's the same thing when you're communicating with your customers. I think one piece to that is, we were talking about the being slow on work and like being over eager, I guess, in your responsiveness to potential customers and things like that. There's a term in the sales world. I think I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but it's called commission breath. Of like, you don't want, your customer to smell your commission breath, right? So you don't want to be too over eager to close the job. Obviously, you want to treat everybody the same, and obviously prioritize people, but setting those boundaries and like responsiveness, setting the boundaries in responsiveness of like, okay, I'm going to get back with this person within a day, something like that. I think that's really realistic.
So you know how much I like precision. So when you bring up commission breath, it makes me think of like, what precisely is that? And I think it's empty communication without purpose. It's almost being like, I'll have salespeople reach out to me. Hey, how are you doing? What's going on? That kind of thing. And I'm like,
you don't actually care.
You really don't have anything to tell me, anything new to communicate. You're just trying to close a deal,
as
opposed to being like, I have updated numbers for you. And then there's a certain level of like when it's customer centered in the sense of like, how can I serve you?
Yeah.
Maybe that's where it's
That's
at.
a good point.
More so than even timing sometimes. I think it's just almost being like, what's being communicated? Yeah. Because maybe the promptness of it, if you call somebody back 5 minutes later and say, hey, got that message, happen to be available. But to your point, maybe they're thinking, well, the next time I have something, 5 minutes later, I expect a call.
Yeah.
How do we handle this here? Our company?
Well, I think, we deal with a lot of like chats, people who we have estimating software. And so we help people who have questions, through chat a lot. And I think it's something we've had to evolve in, of like setting the boundaries. We talked about that, just touched on that a little bit. Of early on, we did not have any boundaries on our chat. We're like, and we want to serve, we want to, be super responsive, be super available. We're also a small team. There's a few of us that are able to help and to serve. So, and a lot of contractors are estimating jobs outside of our office hours. So it's like, how do you handle out of office hour chat and things like that? And I think a lot of that setting expectation side of things is like, well, what are we communicating in the, automated chat response of like, hey, we're real humans and we try to get back to you as soon as possible. But just like even speaking to the fact that we're real humans and we have, families and people that we support and things like that too. Or, it's like Chick-fil-A, right? Closed on Sunday. You know, we just recently, we were like, hey, if there's an urgent issue, please let us know, on Sundays and things like that. But we're like, hey, we're not going to respond to you on a Sunday. And so I think even just setting some of those expectations, if it's urgent, if it's something that we're able to get to, we will. But it's like, let's exceed expectations instead of miss them.
Some guys in our audience might be service-based businesses where weekend call is a thing. Maybe that's something where you need a rotation. You need to be able to set boundaries for certain people so they have space. And we've done some more things here as well of like, okay, who's on call if something like that does happen on Saturday at 8 p.m. So somebody's not everybody's having to
You're just
be
walking
there and
over
do
each
that.
other.
And I think if you are a small team or a solo operator, you're in a spot where you don't have the luxury of being on call availability like that. So go ahead and set that boundary right up front.
Yeah. Or it's going to kill you and your family and
you just can't do that.
You can't.
Yeah. You have to let people know. Okay. I mean, so many guys I know will even do a 2-phone thing where they can turn a phone off. If you're in a spot where you're getting weekend messages all the time that you just can't get away from.
Or you can't say no.
Well, that's
to
my
it,
problem
right?
sometimes. It's like, we don't want to say no.
I
But
know.
like if you're in a spot where it's like, I'm just going to deal with it on
Yeah.
Monday, if you're one of those people pleasers, you need 2 phones.
Yeah.
So turn that work phone off.
I'm going to need another phone. I'm just kidding.
By the way, put that requisition right in there.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this kind of, obviously we're talking about the balance aspect of it as well, but then there's this over communication, meaning, and I think this is a subtle thing to point out, because over communication is where you're more or less having this level of communicating with a customer, but not necessarily around substance. You're trying to keep them in the loop by just talking.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not precision necessarily. And a lot of people new in business know communication is critical.
Mm-hmm.
You want to keep your customers happy. So you want to let them know, yeah, things are going along good.
Yeah.
I remember hiring people on my team, and new in their positions, they were over communicators. They wanted to do things right. They want to make people happy. So they're talking about nothing.
Yeah.
This is over communication. And so you're setting this sort of availability to your customer, like, we're just here to chat.
Yeah.
And you're slowing yourself down from productivity, and you just don't know what to communicate yet. So how do we get away from this? Some of it's process, defining what points do we need to communicate to people about what. And I think it's like intentional communication. You had an excellent insight earlier on this whole like proactive communication versus reactive. What is that?
Yeah. I think a big piece of that, talking to like the substance and the specifics of what you're talking about, is those are 2 different things. Proactive communication and reactive communication are super different. Proactive is, hey, I'm going to educate you on this process of how this is going to work. And then I'm going to have touch points that are meaningful touch points throughout the project. Let's just say fulfillment. Hey, so-and-so is going to be on your job tomorrow. It's looping people in on throughout the process. That's proactive communication. And I think a big piece of, if you are proactive in your communication, you're not going to have as much reactive communication that you have to deal with, of like, hey, fires to put out, things like that. If everybody's in the loop and actually connect, and it doesn't have to be like long conversations, the proactive side. It can just be like, hey, here's a quick touch point, or it's a text. Doesn't have to be a call necessarily either, but it's looping people in on the process so that way everybody knows where they're supposed to be. The customer knows where you're supposed to be, or you're not going to be on the job that day or whatever. It just diffuses situations if you're actually proactive in your communication.
So you're really addressing under communication. It's essentially surprises. Customers say, why is this person at my house right now? Or where is that product? Or where are you?
Yeah, right.
You're supposed to be here right now. And it's like the lack of communication. And so therefore now it becomes reactive in the sense of it's a level 10 emergency because somebody is surprised. Funny enough, when you're new in business, you're just as surprised as your customer half the time. What's my guy doing? What?
Because you're learning it too. Is that what you're saying?
You're learning it. Your team's learning it. If you have a new hire that hasn't been properly trained, you're going to be full of surprises too. I mean, don't ask me how I know that. But so many times during bringing a new person on, I was just as surprised as my customer was in certain situations. I think one thing we didn't introduce as a part of this podcast is we're really talking about communication to customers. Yeah. Not that you couldn't use some of this in dealing with your internal team. Totally. But this is really an externally focused communication with people you serve as customers. Yeah.
Yeah. And the warnings of over communicating versus under communicating versus no communication. Like I think it's a topic that if you can become a master at communication, you will your business will grow. It will excel. You'll be able to, get reputation, high level reviews, things like that.
Under communication is sometimes caused by being green, not knowing what to communicate about. Think back when I first started my business, you didn't necessarily know what would happen. You didn't know how certain subcontractors worked. You didn't have an indication of how vendors would respond to requests for information, quotes, how long things would take to deliver. So you're just dealing with a lot of reactive things yourself. And so therefore under communicating is just because you didn't know. But then there's a danger, which a lot of people in our audience have, and they're not communicating because they're too busy.
They're way too busy. No time.
No time.
Yeah.
And so we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. And I think the other thing would be just about the no communication aspect of it. I have learned and still have to avoid falling the trap of no communication. Yeah. What I mean by that is, let's say you have a scenario. Mathematically, we call this dividing by 0. It's not solvable. And so you might feel like a scenario is not solvable. Like that customer, I don't know how we'd ever make them happy, or that situation just went to,
crap.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It just fell apart.
Yeah.
And so therefore you just feel like running away from it. Like I remember this one time we were building a house. It was an addition on this home, and it was a full basement. My contractor I'd never worked with before on the concrete side of it. He was doing the excavation work. He had done the dig, just miserable because we hit rock. And so he's blasting away at this rock. And because it's an existing structure, you couldn't use dynamite, so we're jackhammering it out days and days and days. Finally gets it deep enough, barely, for our spec.
Oof.
And so he's already frustrated, already feeling like he's losing money, even though we're going to cover him.
Yeah.
Then he had never worked in the county we had been working in here. And then the inspector came out and said, no, it's all wrong. Can't do it that way.
No.
Tear those forms out, redo it. And at that point, he was like, that's stupid. Never heard that before. But got back out there and then started doing it again. Second inspection failed that as well. Oh. What he did was packed the whole team up, packed his crew up, disappeared and blocked my number.
Oh.
And so, and it wasn't that I would have been nasty to him. It's just to him, he knew, well, he might be. Like, I'm walking away from this job. Yeah. I'm ticked off. I'm miserable.
He's got a story of how that's going to go. Yeah.
Right. He's just being like, and I know, like the guy has a reputation and everything else, but no communication to him was less worrisome, less problematic than trying to explain things.
Yeah.
And so therefore, it was the divide by zero scenario. He was done with it. He had failed 2 inspections. It was miserable enough to get there and just disappeared. He's still around, still doing excavation work, still doing concrete. And I think I can relate to that, just trying to run away from a problem. And I see this so often.
To run away.
So often people run away from problems. It feels so easy. But I'm starting to believe more and more in head-on just dealing with stuff.
Yeah.
And I think if he had a conversation with me and said, I'm just fed up with this, Ben.
Yeah.
I just can't deal with this anymore.
Yeah.
I failed 2 inspections. I've got 3 other jobs I'm supposed to be at right now. Those are behind schedule because we're dealing with this one. I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I feel like running off this job.
Yeah.
Maybe we could have worked something out. Maybe I could say, listen.
Problem solved together or whatever. And still
or
kept
let
the
them
reputation.
Go or something. And we've had scenarios like that in our business as well, where you feel like that person's not happy or this scenario needs to be solved. And the head-on communication gains so much respect.
Yeah.
So no communication is often caused by scenarios like that one, where it's like, I don't want to deal with that, or I don't know how to deal with that. The other aspect of no communication is when you feel like I don't have a good answer or don't have an answer yet. And so somebody's saying, hey, when are my windows going to come in? When's that product going to come in? When's the decking going to get done? And you're like,
it's not in yet. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, I'm waiting like you are.
Yeah.
And so then you feel like, I don't want to deal with that. Instead of being like, I don't have a good answer for you yet. Here's what I'm doing about it.
Yeah.
And even letting them know of like, I don't have a good answer for you. Can we wait a week?
Yeah.
You're communicating even by a no answer.
When your customer feels taken care of.
Yes.
In that scenario. They're like, you care about my product or my project,
Taking you guys back to the story that we started this podcast off with, where that disrespect that you communicate by no communication. Yeah. Even if it's, and there's this sort of like unspoken commitment that you more or less have in business that I didn't know at the time. But it's more or less, if you don't respond with a certain window, you say, I'm not going to respond. It might as well be like, I will never respond to you ever. Now, I thought to myself, I will respond. It's just not in 2 days.
No, he doesn't know that.
He didn't know that.
Yeah.
But it was almost like, it's about 1 to 2 days.
Yeah.
And beyond that point, it's like, you disrespected me.
Well, you assume that the person forgot about it. They're not going to get back to it too, like as the consumer on that other
side.
True.
That would be the gracious way to look at it. They forgot about me.
But then that's the disrespect side of like, how dare they forget about me?
True. Yeah. And I think some people be more gracious about this. Some people are going to be a lot more nasty about it.
Yeah. I think one of the things we talked about too, this is, I think, why this topic is so hard, because we're like, hey, what's the right balance of communication? And we're like, well, don't under communicate, don't over communicate, and don't not communicate.
Right. Other than that, it's real simple, guys.
Simple. So it's like, I guess my question is like, we did some prep on like fundamentals of like, hey, if we could just instill like these kind of 3 concepts today in this episode of like ways to improve in the communication side of things. I think the first one that we've hit on a few different times in this is set communication expectations, right? Set those expectations with your client. Hey, me and my team will get back with you within 1 business day. You hinted at that just a minute ago of like setting that up with your customer, with your vendor, with whoever, because communication is not just your customers. I know we're really hitting on that today, but what is the expectation that you can communicate with your client? And I think one of the things I was, we were talking about earlier is I was like, does this change throughout the process of building, right? Like, so from a sales side of things, you're like, hey, you can expect that I'll get back with you within 1 business day. Let's just say you set that up front with your client. Is it the same in fulfillment? Is it the same in collecting, right? Like getting an invoice? What would be your perspective on that?
I think from a reactive standpoint, it's more or less a universal truth.
Mm-hmm.
So you more or less want to set this expectation to the customer that we're going to respond to you within one business day, not concluding the weekends.
Yeah.
And so from a reactive standpoint, but to your point, on a proactive standpoint, well, that could be under communicating or over communicating, depending on the scenario.
True.
Because if it's something like, well, we're waiting a month for the cabinets to show up or something like that. Well, giving them daily touch points of being like, by the way, they got the doors, fabricated today.
Yep.
Tomorrow they're standing. Like that's over communicating.
Yeah.
It'll be here when
Too
it
many
gets here.
details,
Right.
yeah.
But when it comes down to something like responding to them saying, hey, when do you think the cabinets are showing up? And then you're saying, well, we just touched base with our shop on that, and that's probably a 6-week lead time.
Yep.
And then that's setting a 6-week sort of span
That's
before
good.
the next communication touch point needs to happen.
That's good.
I think there's also an aspect that sometimes gets sort of glossed over, is that people usually are not listening on the first time you say something.
True.
Or they don't necessarily hear the right thing. They hear what they want to hear, or they hear... I mean, it's surprising to me sometimes ever play telephone with somebody? By the time you get to the end of the line, you're saying it's laughable how off it is. And I think that's just human nature, where we just hear what we want to hear. And so being able to communicate and then verify that communication was received.
That's good.
And then to your point of like later in the process, you're sending an invoice off or you're sending a change order off. It's not just a send it and done. It's now saying, hey, just want to make sure you receive that, or you have any questions about that. And then more or less that follow-up process.
Yeah. That's proactive.
Yes.
Too,
Yeah. So on the proactive side, maybe this is more about policy and procedure of being like, okay, when we send a change order, we're going to follow up with that a day later.
Yeah.
And then we'll follow up with that 3 days beyond that point.
It's making me think about our conversation with Allie too, a few weeks ago, just even in having contract terms, right? Of like, hey, a lot of this can be put in the contract, but just because it's in the contract doesn't mean your customer read all the details. You know what I mean? So it's like coming back and revisiting what was agreed to, not in like a, hey, I told you it was going to be this, not in a combative way, but in a, hey, we're working through this together. This is kind of our process. Re-educating on the process is super important, I think, throughout the entire construction experience.
I got a contract from a vendor last week, and it was a 20-something page contract. And what they had done, which was brilliant, is they put a TLDR for each section.
What's that mean?
So basically they're saying, this very long form content, here's what you need to know.
Okay.
And so it's being like, we will not sell your information, and we will, respect
like, here's your protections.
Yeah, here's essentially what this means in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And then here's all of the legal verbosity. If that's even
nobody understands.
So I thought that was brilliant. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about too, is people are going to get a contract and they say, yeah. But then when you're walking it through, and I think Allie is a master at this, being able to say, by the way, if you start talking to my subcontractors, this is why that section exists, and here's why it protects you and me.
And there's consequences for your actions.
Yes,
too.
And she enforces it as well by having communication. I think also what serves her really well is she's a master at being direct in her communication as well. Like she really doesn't care. Yeah, like that's the way it is. I'm sorry. Yes.
Get on board or get out. I mean, qualifying.
Yes, right. And I think that serves her client well too.
Totally.
Like precise and on top of the communication. So it's good
expectation. I think another piece of fundamental, so set communication expectations, just being number one. And then another thing we talked about was time blocking. How did that look whenever you were running your construction business in terms of communication? What does time blocking mean?
Well, if you don't block out time for communication, it tends to be the last thing on the list. And in construction, we start early. We're busy doing things, we're managing teams, or whatever it looks like. If you're a solo guy, you're up in the morning, you're getting your things ready. You want to build something. You want to get something done, not talk about it.
Yeah. You want progress.
Right. You want something to happen. Unless you're a big enough team where that your job is communication, then that's different. Yeah. But in a small team, and a lot of people listening to this podcast are in a position where communication is a pain in the rear, kind of an aspect of their job. Yeah. They feel like somebody's always wanting something.
Somebody's
it's
always
exhausting.
mad. Somebody's always whatever.
There's always some aspect to it where it feels draining. And so what you do is, depending on the scale of your business and how much is involved with doing it, you block out time of saying, okay, well, Mondays or Fridays or Thursdays are my communication day, where I'm going to catch up all that stuff, send out my bills, whatever back office process is involved. And then there's a daily aspect of this as well, where you're saying, end of day, I'm going to make sure my texts get cleared out.
Yeah.
If I didn't do that, there would be texts that just didn't get replied to.
Right.
Because I have to go back. Just this morning, I went back. because morning is my communication block.
Mhm.
I went back at those 3-day-old text messages that,
Come on, Ben. Give me your phone. Hal. Sorry.
you know, like, brrr. I mean, some of
Yes.
it though is in the sense of they didn't have a good answer at the moment, or they weren't important.
Yeah.
They needed a response sometime,
Yes.
but it wasn't the most important thing to do at the time.
Yeah.
That's why something would not get forgotten, but get neglected.
Yeah. Thankfully, one little tip is Apple, iPhones actually have it to where you can mark texts as unread.
Yeah, I'm sure every
So
phone
it's
has
like,
that feature.
It probably now,
Yeah.
but it's newer. I'm like,
Okay.
it hasn't always been that way.
Yeah.
So anyway, that helps.
No,
a ton.
that's a good one. Yeah, I like that.
Set communication expectations, time blocking,
Mhm.
right? A day a week, an hour a day. I think the hour a day is a great rule though, instead of a day a week, because it's like if it's a day
Yeah.
a week, you're not getting back to people within your 24
Yeah,
hour.
and maybe that's sort of
time
the
period.
broader theme of like more back office tasks
Okay,
where
that's fair.
communication can be looped into that. But yeah, from a pure communication standpoint, the daily
Hour a day,
Yeah.
something you got to have a daily touch point, or
And maybe it's
time.
15 minutes, but
Yeah.
you got up on it.
Yeah.
Like you block out an hour, you spend 15 minutes.
And then great, and then you can do something else.
Yep. I was just thinking it also protects the rest of your day
Mhm.
because it's almost being like, well, I'm telling people 1 day turnaround time. I handled all my communication for the day,
Mhm.
and now I'm not trapped in the loop of communicating all day long. Now I'm getting stuff done. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Yeah, it's good.
If you're in a spot, particularly as a solo guy,
Mhm.
that's a useful tool.
That's great. And a great rule to, I guess, live by. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then also being proactive. We talked about being proactive versus reactive a lot. What did that look like? Do you have a scenario when you're running a your construction company about just proactive communication? How did that look? Or what was the scenario that went really well?
Proactive communication fundamentally requires you to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and recognize what's important to them.
Hmm.
As a contractor, what's important to you is probably something different than what is important to your customer in a given moment.
Really, as a human being, not just a contractor. We only care about ourselves.
That's a good call out. Yeah. So it requires a certain level of what's important to my customer during each phase of a project.
Mhm.
And you don't master that in day one,
Mhm.
but it's a continual improvement process of being like, well, this is what we discovered was
Mhm.
important.
Yeah.
And so therefore proactive communication is like, it's almost like a checklist of we're going to let people know we'll be coming to the job tomorrow.
Yeah.
Things like when material's going to show up, what that
Mhm.
looks like, and
Yeah.
giving time blocks and windows of time, I should say, of being like, well, between 8 a.m. and noon, we're expecting this to happen.
Mhm.
So I think that's the aspect of proactive communication is identifying those touch points, writing them down, and then checking them off.
Yeah.
What we did was created a checklist, and it wasn't just about communication, but involved communication.
Yeah.
But these are the things that are happening as a part of, say, a bathroom remodel
Yeah.
or a kitchen or a new home.
Mhm.
And then once you identify these are the points we need to communicate with
Yeah.
people about things, selections, whatever else. I mean,
Yeah.
on a negative side, I remember being held up from completing a project because we didn't have things that we needed to get it
Right.
done.
Yeah.
We didn't communicate to a vendor or we didn't get a selection back from a customer. But with a checklist, we were able to say, yes, we communicated with the customer. We're waiting for the selection here. And then you had a follow-up point because that wasn't checked off now.
Yeah. It's good.
So communication around substance.
Yeah.
Not just being like, it's a nice day today.
Mhm.
Well, that's true.
Mhm.
But what is it that we're trying to get done today as well? So
Yeah.
I think that aspect of it as well. Being friendly does not necessarily mean you're communicating.
True.
And vice versa. Some of the more direct people we know, I'm just thinking like,
Like me.
yeah, you're friendly and direct, but I think there's also some people that can be like my HVAC guy,
Mm.
very direct, not necessarily friendly, but he communicates.
Yeah.
You know,
You're
like,
in the
yeah,
loop.
well, I'm going to be there tomorrow.
Like,
Facts.
okay.
Okie dokie. Have a
Not-
nice day
not
too.
as warm, let's just
He's
say.
not warm. He's
Yeah.
not fuzzy at all, but he's a nice guy and,
Yeah.
he gets stuff done. So
Yeah.
I think it can fit your personality. Like
That's
it can
good.
just be, but it just needs to happen.
That's good. I think, and then also just to highlight, we talked about this earlier, but being proactive also includes like it's more than one touch point,
Mhm.
right? So defining it in a contract, yes, that's a touch point, but you're going to have to re-educate on the process throughout of, hey, here's when we're going to invoice you.
Mhm.
So then it's like, hey, maybe even calling someone before the invoice goes out and being like, hey, this is coming out,
Mhm.
scheduled to come out on Friday. Just wanted to make sure you didn't
Yeah.
have any questions, before you sent that. Here's what's going to be included. I mean, you're probably going to get paid faster even
Mhm.
if you're communicating. I mean, I know that's an extra step in the process and people are wanting to cut steps and shortcut to things. But if you're wanting to get paid faster and you're wanting to, for projects to go swimmingly, I think mastering the proactive side is key.
So you set this expectation and then people test you. How
far can I run with it?
well, it's almost like how consistent are you
Mhm.
with the
Yeah,
process?
true.
Because you're saying we're going to be able to bill invoice, or whatever it is once a week. And people say, we'll see about that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do it consistently,
Then
they
expect
realize
it.
then it's same with communication.
Yeah. You're a trustworthy human being and you do what you say you're going to do.
Consistency is what it's all about.
You're right. That's good. So fundamentals, set communication expectations, time block, and be proactive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what are some tips that we can actually, like, how practically can we make a change?
We hawk this all the time, but you have to have some sort of to-do list or notepad with you where you're writing stuff down. You have to not trust your memory.
Yeah.
So basically, if it doesn't get written down, it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, in order to be effective with communication, you're taking notes in conversations.
Yep.
One of the first projects I had done, I had worked for a guy who took incessant notes throughout the entire conversation. And initially it was kind of like a little unnerving because as you're talking, he's writing.
Yeah.
You know, there's a scene from Planes, Fire and Rescue where it's a cartoon.
Okay.
I have 4 little kids, so where the guy's out with the notepad as the inspector comes out and he's like, did he write that down? Yes. Yeah. And that? Yes. And that?
It's taken care of.
So things are getting, and he was like that kind of a guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's writing down all the details. And then 6 months later, we're talking about a conversation and he's like, yeah, I'm going to look at my notes on that. And it wasn't antagonistic. It wasn't trying to prove a point.
Yeah.
He was just saying it's for the record.
Yeah.
And that's how you use notes.
I want to remember
you
it
never
correctly.
use them as a tool to beat people over the head. You'd be like, well, as my recollection of that, but also the notes in the meeting where this is what we discussed, and it jogs people's memory like nothing else.
Yes.
Of being like, oh yes, I remember that now.
Yes.
Details, precision. It's like not just winging it. So taking notes, keeping track of your to-dos, and essential for communication.
Yeah. I think another piece is establishing procedures. You talked about having checklists in your business of when do we communicate, what do we communicate, those kinds of things. But establishing business procedures, especially in training your team on what those expectations are. Let's just say, you're the sales guy and you have somebody that's, the project manager on a project or something like that. Like, you guys got to be in sync on what is it that was sold. To the customer in terms of expectations, in terms of communication, throughout the project. Make sure your PM's fulfilling that too, because it's like if you're saying one thing and then the team doesn't know how to fulfill, then your customer's not getting the experience that they were sold or promised.
Set the expectations more rigorously internally with your team than what your customer expects as well. So if you're saying to your customer 1 day turnaround, well, 4 hours internally.
Yeah, that's good.
And so therefore you can exceed those, not barely meet them.
It's
barely
great.
Squeak by.
Add some buffer to
Yeah.
the expectations for your team. Yeah. And for your customer.
Yeah. And maybe in some industries where you're saying, it's a 3-day turnaround. Like if, don't overcommit,
Sure.
Don't put yourself in a position where you're feeling like you're always lying to people, where you're just saying, well, we're super slammed and busy. Scarcity breeds some of that too as well, where it's like, well, if you're in an industry where people are waiting a year to have your skill and talent on a project, well, some of that, somebody's waiting for you a very long time. So don't overpromise.
That's good.
Once you get there.
Yeah, so good. So tips, track your to-dos, track your tasks so you don't drop the ball, establish procedures and train your team, and don't overcommit really are the tips for, I think, what we're talking about. So what does that unlock for a business? What's the point? Why
are we
do
even
that?
talking about this? Yeah. Because you can wing it. You can just totally ignore this entire podcast, throw it out, rubbish, and just be like, we're going to communicate when we want to communicate, we're going to do however we want to do it. I think if you look at businesses, though, that have really excelled, and I'm not just being from a standpoint of sales numbers, I'm talking about reputationally, people that have excellent reputations. I'm talking about, there's a dental company in town here, 5-star reviews across hundreds of reviews. There's a mechanic in town that we use. Yeah. Hundreds of reviews, 5 stars across the board. Is it that they always were right? No. It's that they were excellent communicators.
Yes.
When something went wrong,
they called you immediately.
And we can think of story after story. Go to the mechanic side. We just had the truck in there last week, and he's, telling me something about what was wrong, and then discovered something was different. Well, there was communication that solved that. Yeah. It wasn't that I expect him to be perfect. It was the fact that, like, hey, we actually discovered that we weren't right about that. We had to change something else out. Sorry about that. We took care of it for you.
So good.
And so I think this is what this unlocks is reputational success.
Yes.
You want to be the best, communicate.
Yeah.
And it's tough when you think it's about doing. It's about quality of work,
Mm.
that's secondary to communication.
Mm.
Some people that are not even all that great of
That
craftsmen.
might offend some people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it would be controversial, but I mean, think about some of the companies that are just doing average work.
Mhm.
Well, maybe that's what their customer wanted,
Yeah,
but they
true.
communicated
Good
well and
point.
said, we do average work and we're going to stay on top of it. And someone said, great, you're hired.
Yeah.
I mean, it was
You're right.
communication what captured
True.
that. So
That's
I think
true.
the other piece of this too is it unlocks growth because you have a certain scalability that you never would have had before with consistent
Mm.
communication. And what I mean by that is if you really look at the checklist side of it, look at process side of it, that's how you scale.
Mhm.
Because now everyone on your team, you brought up training the team. If everyone on the team knows how to communicate, and when it's not as though when I talk to somebody at Congenius, Kinsey's amazing, but the other people are
Yeah.
you know what
Right.
that would be bad.
Yeah.
But if everybody over there is a rock star,
Yeah.
then that's being like, that's replicable. That's
Yeah, that's
success in
good.
the sense of like people know how to communicate. And
Mhm.
so everyone on the team, that training aspect, as you scale, as you've
Mhm.
mastered process and can train it,
Yep. So
you have replicable success. We were talking about this earlier, unrelated to construction, but what makes even franchises successful
Mhm.
is mastering process and mastering communication,
Mhm.
and then they can replicate it.
Yep.
If you have a good experience, bad experience, good experience, bad experience, well,
Not replicable.
it's just, you might make it.
Yeah.
As in survive.
Yeah.
But if it's consistently good. The other thing to keep in mind, guys, is I have a friend who's really not that great at fulfillment.
Okay.
But he's a master communicator. And he has amazing reputation. And so communication is
It
the
masks
secret.
so many things.
It masks so many other things. And a certain level of radical honesty with that too, of like, well,
Mhm.
we're going to take care of that.
Mhm.
Owning things, not BSing people. That's
Yeah.
a big piece of this communication aspect
So
as well. It just makes you a hero to people.
Yeah.
So who wouldn't want that?
So good.
Yeah.
Guys, hope this was helpful. Subscribe, like it. Tell us what you guys have learned. I'd love to know, like, just what are we missing? Obviously, this isn't everything, but I think it's some high points and some practical tips to start walking out.
And I wish, looking back, that some of this would have been part of what I gathered. I mean, there's so many more resources we have today, it seems like, too, with just podcasts. I mean, 25
So
years
much
ago, like
content.
there was just like, you just did what you felt like was the thing to do.
You went with your gut. Yeah.
or
Which
just what
sometimes
you
is a
didn't
good
know
thing.
either.
Yeah.
Yeah. Didn't know what you didn't know. All right, guys.
Have a good one.